here's an experience that I believe I've had and I believe many other people have had. I mean, it's certainly well attested to in the literature on these things. And it's an experience that the Advaita people tend to not acknowledge. Now, this is not true of all of them, but some of them. So, did you ever meet Punjaji in
Yeah,
India?
I spent a year there.
Oh,
Yeah.
you did? Oh, interesting. So, what year?
91, around Christmas. So it was either 90, 91 or 91, 92.
So this is before he had been discovered by the Rajneeshis, and it had a much smaller scene there. I mean, there
Mm.
would have only been a few people in that early, right?
No, no, this was after that. This was after Osho had died. There were quite a few people there. It
Oh,
was
so
getting bigger.
but that had to be later than 91, I think.
No,
Uh,
no, it might have been. I'm pretty certain it was 91, but
oh,
anyway.
interesting. Okay, so yeah, I was there before all of that. Although I thought it was, if I had to have guessed, I would have put it around 91. But so before he was discovered by Osho's people.
Yeah.
So yeah, so anyway, so Punjaji, as you know, was also fairly uncompromising in the way he would talk about this. I mean, he wouldn't, unlike someone like his teacher Ramana Maharshi, he wouldn't make any concessions to practice or to gradualism or to effort. And the explicit message was either you understand what I'm talking about or it's hopeless, right? There's nothing you're going to go do on your own
Mm.
to make any progress, right? So just, understand what I'm saying right now, or there's no path. And if you do understand what I'm saying, there's still no path, right? There's nothing for you to do with
Yeah.
this understanding, right? You're not going to
Mm.
practice the implications of this conversation right now. If you understand, you're done. And if you think you need to practice anything on the basis of what I just said, you didn't understand what I just said, right? So it's like the steepest
Mm.
possible path. So there are two reasons why I think he was wrong about that. And
Mm.
the first is that it was obvious what the consequences of that style of teaching were among many people. People would, seem to see the light in the midst of, having that conversation with him. Somebody would jump up and say, I get it. I
Yeah.
see it. And it was pretty clear from spending some time with those people afterwards that, in the aftermath of their full enlightenment, they were not going to be the next Buddha of the age, right? I mean, these people
Yeah.
were still neurotic and confused in various ways, and now they had been delivered a message that spiritual practice was completely pointless, and they accepted that, but then they went back to their lives and began, seeking happiness in all the usual ways, and they just no longer had a spiritual option.
Yeah.
The path had been taken away from them, and then they're left with 12-step programs and going to Burning Man and what anything else they were doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there was that problem. But there was also the problem that many of us had this more intermediate experience, which is we recognized the non-duality that was being described, but the recognition was unstable. You recognize it, but then you could overlook it again. So
Mm.
essentially your mindfulness became non-dual, but you weren't made perfectly mindful for the rest of your life by virtue of having had this insight.
Yeah.
There still seemed to be something to practice in the sense that there still was this oscillation between being distracted by thought and clearly recognizing what is prior to thought. It's
Mm.
not nullified by the arising of thought, but there's still an apparent difference between recognizing and not recognizing. And Punjaji didn't seem to be conceding that. He's basically said, if you recognize for 1 second, you'll be stable for the rest of your life. And that just seemed to be disconfirmed by the experience of many, many people.
Mm.
So I put that to you as what I perceive to be the liability of this way of talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is very radical. I'll have to say, with the way you describe it, it sounds like what I was talking about as an experience that I had, or non-experience of the I am prior to thought. which seems to be sort of what Punjaji was talking about, which is why he would say, don't take a thought. Or he did suggest, when I was there, he was suggesting, who am I? As I can't remember if he actually said it or if it was just in the crowd who said it. But there seemed to be some suggestion that there was a state that one could be in. And I'm really talking about something radically different.
You don't think Punjaji was also talking about emptiness and non-duality in the sense that you're referencing those things?
It doesn't seem so. It doesn't seem so because he was still talking to someone, suggesting that they do certain things, such as don't take a thought. I can't remember anything he said, quite honestly, but I do remember feeling like there was something that needed to be done. I did not get the radical nature that there wasn't anywhere else. And that experience of something else has to do with an illusory experience of a solidity as a center to the appearance. And I find that his tradition and the people that came after him and the one before him were really talking about something different. Now, if they meant the same thing, I don't know. But the way they talk about it, they make concessions to individuals, and this makes no concessions.
So yeah, maybe I got him in a very Jim Newman mood, because to my ear he was saying the same thing.
Okay.
But I could see that he could be pushed in the direction of making concessions to something that seemed like a practice or...
Yeah. I'm not that well versed on him. I mean, even though I was there for a year, I sat in front of him a couple of times, asked a few questions, and there were always some sort of suggestions of something needed to happen.
It could have been what the Osho people did to him when they got there with all of their tantric energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps you can help me with my apparent dilemma here. So my perception of myself is that I can experience, again, to use a loaded term for which I don't have
It's not loaded in that sense. It's that it points to separation. For experience, there's a subject and an object.
No, and so what I'm about to say is that, experience non-duality, experience emptiness, experience no separation, whatever, however you want to. I'm not sure which verb you like.
I would never, but I just don't see it as an experience. It's just simply not an experience. I know you don't like that. It's not a mind field you're walking into. It's that what's being suggested is just radically different than what's normally expected.
There's nothing that you're saying that is unexpected. It's just I'm not quite sure which words capture it. So what word would you use for the understanding, the recognition of this thing we're talking about?
Yeah. So it doesn't seem, as you pointed to it when you said your hand, you don't actually know what it is.
Yeah.
And the suggestion is that is all there is. And not as a practice or as an experience.
Well, it's the ground of any experience. It equalizes all experience.
Well,
it's not an experience. By that measure, it's not somewhere else, right?
No. Well, what we're reducing is somewhere else to just what is. There isn't anywhere else. So there is only unknowing appearing as a hand. The difficulty we're having, I think, is that I'm literally talking about the end of experience, because the end of the experiencer. And one of the most difficult things I think about this message is it sounds like I'm coming, or this message is coming from somewhere else, and that's not happening there. And really the suggestion is that's all that's happening. And then there's an additional experiencer that's put on top of it that has the illusory experience of knowing that it could get closer to now, or what is, or further away. And the message is truly there is no possibility to get further away from what is or closer to what is. That movement, that apparent differentiation, that apparent experience is illusory. There's only immediacy, unknowable immediacy arising as everything we're discussing. And that never actually moves. There never is anything else. And that has no no beginning or end to it. There's no boundaries to it. So it would be impossible to come up with a word or a definition. When earlier I said, when that contracted energy of me or the positional experience I am falls away, what's revealed, but only as a reflection, as that the appearance is unconditional love. But you can't possibly contain the entire appearance and all that arises with the term unconditional love. That's just a reflection. So really, what we're trying to put into words can't possibly be put into words. What we're trying to drill down on you couldn't create any distance to it, to be able to objectify it, to get closer or further away from it. It's simply already everything.
But there are analogies I think we can draw that are useful, that capture the already true aspect of it and the coincidence of it with everything that's apparent. People are having an experience, or an apparent experience of being selves in the world. And, so we use terms like consciousness and mind and knowing and experience. And it's pretty clear that there are analogs in you just by virtue of the fact that you're having this conversation. You're obviously someone who understands English. Your ears are intact. You can hear me. And you can refer to things in your environment. So there's a kind of consensual, intersubjective reality that can be referenced.
Yeah.
You have the ordinary human operating system that everyone listening is familiar with. So what we're trying to get across is
that I don't have it.
But not precisely that, because again, if needed, someone could say, well, what do you want for lunch? And you'd be able to make that decision, right? So it's not like the public functions have disappeared. And so we know there must be some ordinary residual that answers to the, many of the concepts we're using here, sight, sound, sensations, thoughts.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, this freedom we're talking about would be synonymous with some kind of brain damage, right? We're not celebrating brain damage. We're trying to get at the nature of reality. If only it were that easy. A hammer would be
That's right.
You could just hand out
lobotomy.
hammers. Yeah. So how would you describe the phenomenon of someone listening to you teach and getting the point? Like, surely that's happened, and you meet those people.
Yeah.
What is that like, and is there anything to be usefully said about the cusp of that moment for people?
But because it's an unhappening, and because nobody wants it, I wouldn't even call it a teaching. A teaching for me has to do with knowing, and you're not, and just to draw clear boundaries, I don't think it's just being pedantic, but it is pointing to something. And I guess the most common response when there's some sort of recognition of what we're talking about is surprise. That it just is completely unexpected. And that seems to be true universally. That it just has nothing to do with the expected need or wants of the individual and what it thinks this is about. It's a surprise. And it's disconcerting. Often when that solidity falls away, it isn't what anybody would have wanted. And when the solidity comes back, there's often, when it falls away, there's often, because it's maybe not complete, there's a panic or a fear that arises. And then it comes back, and there's then the wish for it to happen again. So it doesn't seem to happen in the purview of what one would call a normal experience or normal process.
Well, that's interesting. So in your experience, people can have this insight into non-solidity, and then the solidity or apparent solidity can come back, and there seems to be more seeking or more orienting toward it there. And then so say more about that. I mean, how...
It was the same with me. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was the same with you. So you had this experience, and then then you were left seeking, trying to get back to it for a time. But then when you got back to it, were there more iterations of that, or once you got back the second time, then there was no more fluctuation in it?
So for me, if you wanted to describe it as a process, and just so that you understand the paradox of describing this, which is all there is already, as a process of becoming this, which is everything already, which is the dream of the individual. It was the fog of ownership, the fog of knowing, as I talked about before, the cloud of knowing just clears up. It just clears up. There can be certain climacterics, like I expressed earlier about the falling away of the contracted energy and how that builds up. But really, that's all completely irrelevant. There is, in the end, this happening isn't relevant. This appearance isn't relevant. And what you point out is that there's a functioning that still happens. But that's never been any different, really. There's just no longer the ownership that arises for the functioning of knowing where the house is, or where all the things you described before, as though this body is called Jim and its history and the ability to talk about what I just talked about. That all arises. It just doesn't arise for a center. And just to be clear, there are no centers already.
Yeah.
So this isn't about, the message has no intention on changing the appearance, because there's obviously nothing that needs to happen. That need only arises in the experience of the individual.
Right. But there is this, I guess what I'm fishing for here is, this seems to be distinct from either the actual teaching or the misunderstanding of what Poonjaji was teaching, which is that the expectation there was that if you recognize this thing, non-solidity, non-duality, no center, that first recognition would be permanent, or else you haven't really recognized it, right? So it's
absolutely
all or nothing.
Absolutely, that's true. But that's true. I don't know if he and I we're talking about the same thing, but as I described the falling away of that, the I am and here is the first thing that's known. That isn't the end of the individual. The end of the individual is the end of that knowing experience, the knowing cloud that seems to be the center of the appearance. And that isn't a happening, and it's impossible to pinpoint actually when that actually happens, because it isn't something added on. It's just a clearing up of an illusory sort of fog in which everything seems to arise, as long as there's someone there.
But you were just describing people who have this experience where it drops away, but then they get, anxious, or it's not complete, I think you said, and then
That's right.
And then it comes back. But there's a different kind of I guess I'm just trying to reconcile two maps of the landscape that perhaps can't be reconciled, but I think one subsumes the other in a way. I mean, so like, I don't know how familiar you are with Dzogchen or any of these other non-dual teachings.
Vaguely.
But they would certainly acknowledge that for some people, the first glimpse is the last glimpse, right? And you're basically done in a second, on a Thursday afternoon, the apparent person vanishes. But for other people, the glimpse can be had, but it's possible to still get, distracted by thought thereafter. And then the glimpse is no less of a glimpse of this, underlying ground of, to use a term that the Buddhists love, of emptiness. But you then have to become more familiar with it. There's some apparent work to do to stabilize this intuition, because in fact, you will just be, you're not the lucky person who had a single glimpse that was final. You're somebody who is capable of being lost in thought again. You're being distracted by the apparent contents of consciousness. Whereas somebody like Poonjaji, and many people in the non-dual tradition outside of a tradition like Dzogchen are unhappy with that picture, that they just think that that's not, in fact, phenomenologically true. to glimpse it once is to be done. And I mean, I think there are reasons to doubt that picture. I'm just wondering which claim you're actually making.
Both. I think I quite understand where the misunderstanding is, because I described the falling away of the contracted energy, but that isn't the end of the experiential center. Or describing this as unconditional love is not the end of the experiential center. Those are all aspects that are revealed as the contracted energy falls away, the end of knowing. And I can imagine that if one was saying that that was all there was to see, and I think there might actually be people that say that, then there's just still someone there who thinks they know what happened. And here what's being described is that all of those apparent recognitions are still a part of a process and still a part of a story and still a part of the experience that what isn't real. And the end of it, once seen, which it isn't, and there is no end, is the end of that story, the end of this appearance. And I think we're getting hooked up on this a little bit. The end of this appearance as actually having a context, because it doesn't. And when this appearance is no longer contextual, then whatever arises is just a part of that non-contextual appearance. So when there's no longer a context, there is no longer an ability for a context to arise, because everything arising is simply non-contextual. So that even if you could imagine, which I don't know, that the me or whatever, the contracted energy would arise again, that would still be just non-contextual happening, chaos happening, appearing as whatever this is appearing as. And I don't seem to be able to get it across, but that is already the case. Everything else that seems to happen within that is just part of the dream of the individual, which is constantly within a process. This isn't a process. This is already non-contextual.
Yeah. Well, so here are a few things I believe. I believe I understand you. I believe we're speaking about the same thing. And again, the terminology here could trip us up. But I believe that this thing you're pointing to is something fundamental about the nature of all experience, consciousness and its contents in every moment, that's not constructed, that doesn't get improved, that doesn't get produced by one's effort. It is the non-context of everything that is appearing. I believe I recognize that and can recognize that whenever I pay attention. Again, now that me using a term that has dualistic overtones that are not intended here, but to recognize the centerlessness of the moment. That is obvious to me and is obvious whenever I remember to notice it, right? But I do find that I'm capable of overlooking it.
Yeah.
The apparent individual, I'm capable of being asleep and dreaming again in some sense, if only for moments at a time. And that dream is being continually punctuated by this recognition of no inside and no outside, or no center. On one account, I either don't get it. On another account, I get it imperfectly and am still working out this non-path by this non-dual logic. Within a Dzogchen context, my experience is perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
I'm having the expected experience in a Dzogchen context. In your context, I think I can be heard to not get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I don't see any basis for that claim in my experience.
No, you wouldn't.
Okay, so then help perform surgery on my
I can't.
Ignorance.
All
here.
I can say is you say you recognize the non-center, the non-inside and outside. I've never recognized that. I've never recognized what's being shared here. It has no solidity, fixedness, knowing in it.
Okay, but I agree. I think we're just using the term recognition differently, or it's got some onus on it in your brain that it doesn't have in mine. But I think if we want to describe what emptiness is like, I expect we're going to agree. Write down. We'll check all the
I
boxes.
couldn't.
But
I couldn't describe emptiness.
well,
Just like I couldn't describe
you
what is.
but you just started by saying it's the non-solidity, the non.
Hmm.
Just you described it in terms of what it's not, which is obviously quite a traditional way of doing it. The fact that it's not produced, it's not compounded, it's not many things, it's not one thing, right? It's not unity, but it's
Well, I think the
not
reason
unity.
it's spoken about in negative terms is because it can't be conceived. It can't be. That's where the landmines are. Is it seems like there's a response when it seems like this which can't be spoken of is put into a context of understanding or knowing or consciousness or recognition. That seems obviously part of the experience of knowing.
All right, so I mean, we're getting wrapped around the axle here a little bit, but I think
Uh-oh.
it's useful because here's what I'm imagining. I'm imagining that our listeners are more confused than they need to be by our apparent
Mm.
non-alignment here, or not actually being able to totally converge on how to talk about this. I'm going to tell you two stories here that get at parts of the problem that I'm trying to get across, and it'd be interesting to get your reaction to them. So the problem I've had with this style of kind of radical non-duality and an apparent unwillingness to make certain traditional distinctions, so certain pathy sounding distinctions, is the following. And this came out of my experience with Punjaji. So as I said, there were many people who were studying with Punjaji who would have some epiphany with him, they'd have some breakthrough, and he would celebrate them as essentially the Buddha of the day, right? So
Yeah.
like
Mm.
somebody, I was there once with a few Buddhist teachers who we had brought to see Punjaji. We were spending 10 days with Punjaji, and then we were going to get Dzogchen teachings from Tulku Urgyen in Nepal, who we hadn't yet met. And so it's kind of a spiritual tour. And so we went to Punjaji first, and somewhere near the end of our stay there, this woman had some kind of breakthrough, and she was really a wonderful person. She, just a very happy person, a good advertisement for the benefits of full enlightenment. And Punjaji was celebrating her as essentially done. She had finished the whole program, right? She had this breakthrough, and she was talking the talk of there's nothing but consciousness, or there's nothing but emptiness, and so on Punjaji's account, there was no more to do. There was no more distinctions to make. Any talk about meditation or effort or paths at this point would have been blasphemy, essentially.
Mm.
And then we were leaving to go to see Tulku Urgyen, and this woman asked if she could come with us. She just wanted to kind of probably test her enlightenment against some other system. And so she, as she was a very nice woman, we thought, yeah, great, she's good company. So we went to Nepal, and so we were in the room with her and a few other people getting Tulku Urgyen's non-dual teachings. And once that process started, at some point, he asked for questions, and she launched into her Punjaji-approved account of her own
Mm.
enlightenment. And this was a fascinating moment because, I had to get through translation, which was amusing. But once it became clear what she was claiming about herself, she was claiming there was no individual. She was claiming, much of the language you have used and I have used in this conversation, she was expressing. And at one point, Tulku Urgyen said, "Well, how often are thoughts arising for you? How often are you thinking, and what's that like?" And she said, "Oh, no, I haven't had a thought in a week."
Mm.
And he said, "Well, wait a minute." It was comical to see how this was struggling to get through translation. But at a certain point, he said, "Okay, we're all just going to wait for you to have your next thought. I can't proceed with what I was planning for today's seminar until we drill down on this. So we're all patient people. We're just going to wait for you to have a thought."
Mm.
And over the course of 30 seconds, we watched her enlightenment completely unravel. What became clear is that she was, she was a very happy, kind of ecstatic person who was, had a lot of concentration or some concentration, and she was having a great experience, right? She was very blissful.
Mm.
And she was probably just thinking incessantly about how empty everything was and how beautiful and how non-dual. And like she was just not mindful enough to know that she was lost in very happy thoughts basically every moment of the day, right? So that's what I see as a liability here, that if you're not going to avail yourself of any pathy language, that will allow you to differentiate the difference between being lost in thought or not, you can't necessarily catch the people who come away thinking that they're Buddhas or that there's nothing left to do or that any use of attention is just as much a symptom of ignorance as any other use of attention. Whereas I don't know what went on to happen to her, but my perception of that moment was that, Took Oregon had performed a kind of necessary spiritual intervention, essentially, and got her back, made her available again to recognizing what her experience actually was. And, she could look more deeply into things, whether you call that practice or not. Anyway, that was the first story that was in my brain to bounce off of you. I worry that if the path is infinitely steep, people bounce off of it in ways that are, unfortunate.
Yeah. I think what's being shared here is truly unwantable in that sense. Whereas, as you said, as you described with Punjaji, that was something that had some kudos to it of no thinking or bliss. That's just not, there's this, and I guess what's being shared isn't a teaching. I think a lot of our misunderstanding isn't pedantic. It's different. It's a perspective running into no perspective, because this isn't a teaching, and it isn't actually concerned in that sense of the people that come. It's not expected for anybody to get anything. It's not intentional, the message. It merely points out, and I think what's already in a way known and undeniable, and that is what seems to be happening. This is everything. And that can be misunderstood. I mean, people walk away and go, well, Jim says there's nothing to do. And that's just simply not what's being suggested. The suggestion is there isn't anyone that ever does anything, and that sense of need to find something missing is illusory. I totally believe people misunderstand it. I'm certain that that's a lot of what happens at the meetings, is that it's misunderstood. It's very difficult because you can't reference it at any point because it's not within anyone's experience. And you can't relate to it because it doesn't meet the needs of the individual for something to happen. One of the core experiences of the individual is that something needs to happen. That's still part of the illusion. And that will take what's being suggested and try to put it into practice. I call it applied non-duality. It just doesn't make any sense. Non-duality isn't something separate as a concept to be attained or found. It's pointed out as from this perspective, it's pointed out as non-duality because there isn't any separation already. Any effort to attain is merely the obscuring the fact that it isn't separate. There isn't a separation to overcome.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think that's a useful concept that may differentiate or may clarify the ways in which we're talking past each other here or at cross purposes. So, applied non-duality. In my view, there certainly seems to be a stage of this process where applied non-duality isn't as crazy or as counterproductive as you seem to suggest, right? I mean, there's something to recognize again for many people. And it's not that the first recognition wasn't of the real non-duality. It's just that it wasn't final. within the dream, the experience of waking up from this dream can have apparent stages for people, even though once you have finally woken up, it may not make any sense to talk about stages, or the stages were illusory, right? So,
but they don't have anything to do with anyone.
yes.
The experience or the idea that there's a process, or that they have something to do, or that there's a benefit is still a part of the illusory experience, that this has some intention to it, the appearance. And that implies that there's a better way for this to be and a worse way for this to be.
But then what do you mean when you use a term like unconditional love, right? I mean, that's some ancillary benefit of this, or some aspect of this that is, I'm not surprised at all by that term, but I would have been surprised if you had said unconditional anger or unconditional shame, right?
Same thing. As far as I'm concerned, those are all really the same thing. Unconditional love is merely a response to the conditional experience of the individual, that love is conditional. And when that falls away, it's obvious that there isn't any condition to love. But I think it would be a fallacy to say that that what we're talking about is unconditional love, because really what we're talking about is what can't be spoken about. There's actually no way to find an edge or an other in order to objectify or define the whole of the appearance. And here comes another one that's not true, but it's just another reflection of that falling away of the conditional freedom of the individual. It's too unconditionally free to be defined or contained. And what's recognized is that the whole process is that unconditional freedom, having the experience that something needs to happen. It is that unconditional love, having the experience that it's conditional. So there's just simply no separation to overcome. That only arises in the illusory experience of the individual. And the illusory, but truly illusory experience of the individual. There's no individual.
Yeah, no, so the second story I was going to bounce off of you, which is one I just stumbled upon. I think it's about 10 years old, but I stumbled upon it relatively recently. There was a tourist bus somewhere in Scandinavia, I think Norway, Sweden, somewhere, and they pulled into a rest stop, and there were about 30 people on the bus, and the tourists got off to use the bathroom and get something to eat, and one of the tourist was I believe an Asian woman who got off, and she changed her clothes before getting back on the bus. And when everyone was back on the bus, some people noticed that there was an Asian woman who hadn't yet gotten back on the bus, who they were concerned not to leave behind. And so they went looking for her and couldn't find her. And then a search party was formed, and they called the police, and they readied a helicopter that was going to take off at dawn to look for this missing tourist. And at some point during these machinations, I mean, many hours into it, the woman realized that she was the missing tourist, right?
Yeah.
And so this struck me as a beautiful analogy for the process we're talking about. It's not true to say, but when you focus on what that moment of epiphany was like, when the tourist who was never lost, discovers that she is part of the search party that is part of the problem looking for her, it's not true to say that the search was ever consummated. The lost tourist was never found because the tourist was never lost, right? And there's something in that unraveling that is instructive here, that you're not, when you recognize the way, again, to use my terms here, the way consciousness already is, the fact that it already doesn't have a self in the middle of it, and it doesn't get improved by what it knows. There's nothing you need to do to it to make it empty or expansive or non-dual. Then that recognition has this quality of the very premise by which you sought to recognize it, that effort it's not fulfilled. It's just the basis from which you made it has been undercut. But again, I do, it's my experience, and I'm certainly not alone in this, that there's this stage or apparent stage in this process where you're still having to notice this. Again, I don't know which verb is sanctioned here, but you're still having to become more familiar with this. Otherwise, there's this apparent experience of being able to overlook it, for the purpose of getting angry or getting distracted by things in the world, or, getting awareness trimmed down by something that happens to which you're reacting, to which once again, you are the ape who is reacting to the world. And then the process is one of cutting through that again and noticing this intrinsic mystery to experience, to consciousness.
Yeah.
And yet what I'm hearing from you is your concern that really isn't the recognition. I realize recognition is not your favorite term, but that isn't the insight, that there's something more or less to be discovered here that emphatically ends this pseudo search. There are no stages to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That there isn't actually a mystery that needs to be solved. The experience that there needs to be an answer just comes out of the illusory experience of separation. That this mystery is never actually solved. The lost individual, the lost tourist is never found.
But I agree with that, right? It captures to me how things seem when I'm paying attention. Right?
Let's drill down. Can I ask a couple of things and just drill down on a couple of points, such as consciousness? Because it's just obvious here that that is part of the illusory experience of the individual. Consciousness is an experience in separation. And in that experience, one can be more or less conscious. And that changes the perspective or the experience of the individual.
Yeah, so I'm not using consciousness in that sense. I mean, I would use it as synonymous with this apparent happening, right? The fact that anything is appearing, the fact that anything seems to be any way at all, is the fact of consciousness.
Yeah, but you're talking about being able to be more or less conscious, and that having to do with being more or less aware.
No,
more or less. You use certain words. I can't remember your words exactly.
Well, no. Conventionally speaking, there are degrees of consciousness, with respect to, wakefulness, general anesthesia. I remain agnostic as to what it's actually like to be in some of those states that we can't remember, whether it's a failure of memory or an actual interruption of consciousness. That's very difficult to distinguish. But in terms of degrees of awareness of this thing we're talking about, I mean, I would agree with you. It's paradoxical. It makes no sense to overlook it.
It's not possible.
Well, it's apparently possible because there's this
only in the illusory. But the overlooking is an illusion. It never actually happens.
Yes.
So the idea that you could make it unhappen, it's just part of the illusion, part of the experience that it is happening. It never happens. It's not happening now.
That's true. That's true. But to use your language you used before, this wisp of a cloud that can just go away, right? Like the sense of self, the sense of there being an individual in the middle of experience, that can evaporate, right?
Yeah.
But
the evaporation is recognized as never having happened. So it's not something that's added on. It's not, I now have a new experience. It's actually the evaporation of experience. And what's left is the recognition that there never was experience, but that's not a recognition of what this is.
Okay, but then what would you say to someone who believes that this evaporation experience can happen many times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times?
I don't agree with that. I think there can be many different sort of revelations, uncoverings of what's being hidden by the illusory experience of the individual. But the end of the cloud of ownership is the end of experience, the end, as we said, context. And then there's thereafter, of which there isn't a context which anything could arise and create a context. There is just simply, but it's already the case. I mean, it's so obvious that what's happening isn't connected to anything else. It's whole in and of itself. It has no need to have a history. It has no need to have a future. It is in and of itself whole, and in that way singular, unconnected to anything else. And so you can't even really wrap your arms around it conceptually, because it's just simply without limit. And anything that arises is that. Just because there's a thought of the past is not evidence of a past. It merely is this non-contextual appearance appearing as a past. So there would be no way for anything to happen to create a need of context. Now, the brain still functions. This can still find home in the grocery store and all of that. But that doesn't happen within a context for anyone. It's just simply what is, arising as whatever function seems to be happening. And there's nobody conscious of that. And you couldn't get closer or further away from it. That whole experience is just part of the illusory dream. And everything that happens in it as far as a process is merely a process, an illusory process inside this, which is already non-contextual.